3 הימים הראשונים, אני כפות בידיים מאחורה, כפות ברגליים, עם חבלים שקוראים לי את הבשר, וקצת אוכל, קצת מים ביום. אני זוכר שאני לא מצליח להירדם מהכאבים, כי גם החבלים כבר בתוך הבשר, וכל תנועה אתה רוצה לצרוח, וגם אתה כפות עם ידיים מאחורה, אז הכתפיים נורא נורא כואבות, ושום תנוחה לא מספיק טובה. ואז יש רגעים שאתה פשוט מתעלף. אתה מתעלף, אתה מאבד את ההכרה, מתעורר אחרי 2-3, והכאבים ממשיכים.
That is the voice and visage of Eli Sharabi in an interview with Israeli journalist Ilana Dayan that aired on Israeli television last Thursday night. Each survivor who returns alive from Gaza convulses this country afresh. But Sharabi, I believe he has been the proverbial final straw after an onslaught of devastating testimonies from the hostages who have been in Hamas captivity since October 7, 2023. Sharabi has become the catalyst for a moral awakening in this numbed nation. His journey has also had a significant impact on so many, including President Trump. On Monday, tomorrow, Eli Sharabi, along with 2 other as yet unnamed survivors, will be flown to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Trump on Tuesday. The president watched a 5-minute clip of a 1-hour interview that went viral with subtitles. And that was it. It is impossible to watch it only once. It is impossible to forget it. I watched the entire 1-hour interview when it was broadcast last Thursday, and I don't think I'll ever be quite the same. Last Thursday, when the Sharabi episode of Uvda, Israel's equivalent of 60 Minutes, when that episode was broadcast, a shock surged throughout this country. Everyone watched it, and to a person, we were shaken, in good ways and bad. We were shaken not just by the horrors Sharabi described, but also by the dignity, the decency that this tortured man radiates. In today's discussion, I speak with a returning guest on State of Tel Aviv and a good friend of this podcast, Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Jonathan Conricus. He also serves as a senior fellow with the Washington, D.C.-based think tank, FDD, and he's a frequent media commentator and sought-after speaker on every continent. In fact, Jonathan Conricus had just returned from a successful speaking tour in Australia before jetting off last night to the United States. We were lucky to catch him standing still. Israel is a nation obsessed with hostages and this grinding war that we must win. And how we reconcile those 2 conflicting aspirations is the current dilemma. I am recording this on Sunday, March 2nd, in the afternoon, Israel time, which is 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Good morning to you. And I woke up this morning to the news of Eli Sharabi's upcoming trip, and also to the fact that Hamas has refused to return to the negotiating table to discuss the release of the remaining hostages. Israel has said fine, no hostages, no ceasefire. The opening salvo then, we will not permit any aid trucks to enter the Gaza Strip, not from Israel. At the moment, that's where we are. By the time you watch this, who knows? Conricus and I dive right into this very Solomonic moment in Israel. Do we go to war? Do we free all the hostages? How do we do that? He and I agree and disagree, but we go deep, raw, and real. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now working hard to stay informed and share what I learn with all of you. Stay with us. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, Saturday, March 1st. In Israel, it's wonderful to see you. Thanks for making time to speak to the state of Tel Aviv before you jet off yet again to do another speaking tour in the States. How are you?
Yep, I am as well as can be. On a personal level, great. Reeling from, I'd say, watching the last week's proceedings, and where I think I'm hurting the most is my pride. It is seeing Israeli men and women manhandled around and told what to do, like mannequins on a stage, by these Hamas thugs. And the mere fact that Hamas is still there to run media events, it is infuriating. I am enraged by it. And every testimony I hear from hostages, just a few days ago, yesterday it was actually, I listened to Eli Sharabi, this role model of a person, this absolute hero. Yes, tell his story on Uvda with Ilana Dayan. A lot of mixed emotions, a lot of tremendous sadness for the fact that our people had to endure this, rage at the tremendous military and intelligence and political failure that led to this, and the tremendous strength that we see people like Eli display, but he's not the only one. After enduring this horrible torture in Hamas captivity for so long, to come back, dust himself off, and get into the fight to get all of the hostages back, and to educate people of what he endured, with very little filters, very little self, very exposed. And to do that, I watched it in its entirety, and it was just, I think, an essay of courage and human spirit. It reminds me of, reading books of survivors after the Holocaust, and people who were able to keep their integrity and honor, and who remain humans after such an ordeal. So very mixed emotions, and bottom line, what really challenges is that I know that we are far from out of the woods. There's still a lot of fighting to be done, and this is a ceasefire, but it's not the end of the war here.
Absolutely. And I want to just pick up for a moment before we delve a little further into this very complicated moment, militarily, diplomatically, and psychologically in Israel. I, too, of course, watched the Uvda, which for our viewers is the equivalent of 60 Minutes in Israel. And it was only better.
Only better, not biased towards Palestinians like 60 Minutes so many times is.
Fair enough. But, in the heyday of 60 Minutes in the 70s, when I watched it more religiously, and the 80s, 60 Minutes, Nightline, the great era of the best of American television before the decline began. The Ilana Dayan Uvda interview was extraordinary for so many reasons. But when she began, you'll recall, she asked him at the beginning, why are you doing this? And he sits there and he still looks like a shadow of the man he was physically.
Yeah.
There is so much seared into his face and his eyes. And he said, I'm doing this for Alon. Alon Ohel is a 24-year-old young Israeli man who was at the Nova Music Festival. And he was held with a group of men, young men in their 20s. Eli Sharabi, of course, was the eldest. And he said that he and Alon formed this immediate, intense bond. They were all very close, these men. But he speaks of Alon now as a father with a son, and this incredibly intense responsibility he feels towards him. The heartbreaking separation when they took Eli to release him, and Alon was still being left, I believe, with Omer Enkert, one or two other people who have since left, and Alon is all alone. But Eli said Alon was hysterical, crying for 15 minutes, and the Hamas thugs had to peel Eli away from Alon, and he said it was the most heartbreaking thing and moment for him, and he promised Alon, I will not leave you behind. And he says, I speak for all of them, but I am here for Alon. Eli Sharabi, of course, spoke so eloquently about so many things, and I hope that someone soon puts subtitles on the entire interview because it's really important. But you mentioned also that it's just this incredible testament to human dignity, the will to live, and of course, for all of us, in part because of his cadaverous appearance when he was released, and which, even though he's put on some weight, persists, reminds us all of the photographs and images at the end of the Holocaust. And I have to say that as Eli Sharabi spoke, I, of course, was thinking of Viktor Frankl's brilliant, slim volume, Man's Search for Meaning, which, if I can be reductionist for a moment, reduces to this. He, of course, was a psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, survived Auschwitz, and wrote this book that's been one of the most impactful in my life because he tries to answer the question, what causes people to persist? Why do they not just despair and give up? And there's always something that motivates. It's like programmed into our DNA for survival. Something that motivates the human being to want to make it to the next moment. Whatever
Yeah.
small that is. And Eli talked about that, of course, in terms of the ravenous hunger that he said he couldn't explain, but even the possibility that they might throw a dry, horrible fig at him was enough to live for the next moment. And then he comes out of captivity and learns that his wife and daughters were murdered, and he'd hoped all this time, that was his greatest hope and motivation to make it through that horrible 500 days, whatever it was, more or less. And now, what motivates him? Alon.
Yeah, is to get his fellow hostage out, and what I hope to be wrong, but the tragic, horrible reality. If we ascend down from big philosophical topics, the meaning of life, human nature, resilience, and the ability to perform, I think, amazing feats of survival as embodied by Sharabi. If we look at the current situation, negotiations as we're speaking, they appear to have stalled, and Hamas is hardballing. Israel is demanding our hostages back, and we are currently in, I would say, some twilight zone between having run the course of the first phase of the ceasefire deal and still not having negotiated a second phase, and where Israel has not withdrawn from the Philadelphia corridor as it agreed to do at the end of the first stage, and where Hamas now is saying, well, we're not going to release additional hostages. So when Eli Sharabi did what he did and went on to Uvda, I think he did it very clear-mindedly with lots of sound strategic and media advice, because that is really what is at stake here. It appears that we are at that fork in the road where Israel has to make that decision. Do we continue and try to get the remaining Israeli hostages home? At what price? Or is it that we go back to fighting and actually dismantle, eviscerate Hamas, as we haven't done over the last year and a half? And of course, sadly, what it means for Alon and 58 additional Israeli hostages, out of whom we suppose that 24 are alive. What we can assume is that this would be extremely fatal, could be fatal for those hostages if we go back to fighting. And I think that's really the dilemma that we are now. It's really coming to the fore. And I personally believe that this appearance by Eli Sharabi can have strategic consequences, and that leaders on the Israeli side listened, and it may, move the needle. Bottom line, the sum of the situation is we still haven't achieved what we need to achieve against Hamas. We still have a jihadi Nazi entity at our doorstep that we have not yet uprooted and not yet defeated, and it still controls Gaza, and they still control and have 59 Israeli hostages. I sadly do not see a way to square that circle where we get both. And I think that we are nearing both, as in defeat Hamas and get all of our hostages back. And it's a, in the Bible we speak about, Solomon's choice. I think this is the Solomon's choice at the national level that no other country really has dealt with. And we're getting very close to real decision time.
Well, you're much more of a military man than I am woman. And so I want to really draw on your expertise in this area. The whole kind of, as the goal as it was articulated from October 7 was the total destruction of Hamas. I still don't really understand what that means. You and I both watch the same people talking on television here and writing in the media and saying that, it's 30 plus years later, Al-Qaeda still exists. ISIS still exists. The weight of the Western world's military capability was thrown at those jihadists. The Taliban exists, and it has defeated Russia and America and combined allied force. So in this context, for us to even sort of believe, I'm going to suggest that Hamas could be obliterated militarily, forget about the ideology, because that'll never go away, but militarily in such a short period of time may have been unrealistic. So I want you to kind of address that, but wrap it into what I believe to be the most salient issue, which is bringing home all of the hostages. And I feel that the war with Hamas can be put on the back burner for a short time, but their lives can't. And the blow that their deaths in captivity will deal to this country, I think will be also fatal. And if I just might add, I feel that there has been a seismic shift in Israel in the last 6 weeks as we've been watching these horrific, grotesque propaganda theater productions put on by Hamas. And our leadership has been very quiet. We have not heard from Benjamin Netanyahu this week. It may have been the most extraordinary week in the history of this country. Maybe he put out one short statement when the Bibas funeral happened, but he has been very quiet, as has all of the leadership in the government.
Yeah, no, I think you make many very important points. I have a different opinion about the first part, the military part, and but I totally agree with you on leadership. Leadership, I think we have absentee leadership. I think that the people of Israel deserves much better when it comes to clarity, and where the elected leadership that was responsible for this unprecedented catastrophe in Israeli history, to inform the Israeli population, the people of Israel, what's the strategy and where are we going. And, Israelis have become accustomed to, and it looks like they're accepting, having this type of absentee leadership. The only statement that the Prime Minister put out this week, it's two. One of them, Bivas, and the second was that he had issues with why wasn't I presented with the after-action reviews of the IDF, and I should have seen them first. Not saying, I'm responsible. Of course, there should be a national board of inquiry, and that the buck stops here. I'm the elected leader. I've been prime minister for the last 15 or 20 years. And as such, I bear responsibility not only for the successes, which he's very happy to take credit for, but for the failures, which I have not heard my prime minister speak about, or maybe once fleetingly after lots of pressure. And this week continues that lack of leadership. I would even say cowardice when it comes to communicating truthfully and clearly, transparently with the Israeli people what it is that we're doing. What is the plan? That is one thing. But setting that aside, and sadly, I think we're used to, we're, some processes in Israeli society were coming a little bit similar to Lebanon, a failed state to our north, which is used to not having leadership, which is used to not having strategy, which is used to petty politics governing the future of that country. We're not at all as far off, and we have a beautiful, strong people which is united, which is patriotic, which cares, and that I think is the main difference. But in terms of leadership, failing. Now, the big difference here between, if we go back to the military, the big difference is that all of the other situations that you described, Afghanistan, Iraq, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, we're talking about expeditionary missions by Western militaries that went far away from home to fight an enemy that only at worst was an indirect threat to the homeland, if at all. That's not our situation. I think that after October 7, it is clear, abundantly clear, for even the people who were the most, I don't know if ostracious, as in ostrich, is a word, but people who refused to look at reality and recognize it. What are the organizations and people that we have just beyond our doorstep? Even people who didn't want to recognize that today understand that living alongside a genocidal organization that simply wants to kill all the Jews, and they're waiting for the ability to be able to do so, that isn't something that we can agree with. And while I do indeed agree with you that the moral imperative of us, of the state of Israel, is to get all the hostages home, I agree with that. But in my mind, what Israel needs to do is to guarantee the safety and the survival of the Jewish state. That is imperative number one. And where I think that we have not been successful is in actually getting that done over the last year and a half. We've done a lot, but not enough. Some of it is because we were limited by our friends and allies to do what actually was needed in order to bring that enemy to its knees and actually decapitate and dismantle control by Hamas of the Gaza Strip. And the key to that is humanitarian aid. As long as humanitarian aid is flowing in to Gaza, and it is flowing into Hamas and their front organizations, UNRWA, then Hamas stays in power. The moment that we change that, we reroute that, and we do it through Israeli hands, Hamas will have a serious structural business problem because they won't have leverage of the civilian population. I think that is where Israel will go in the future. I think that is what will happen. And I think that is what eventually will bring Hamas, the remaining parts of Hamas, to its knees. And I think that is why Hamas will be destroyed. And we'll be able to look back at this podcast and this time in history, maybe a few years from now. I think this will be the turning point where we rewrite history books, and it'll be the first time that a non-state terrorist organization will be defeated and uprooted permanently by a nation state, by Israel. And it'll be the first time, and perhaps and hopefully not the last time, that a terrorist organization really is dismantled after attacking a democracy. Now, that still is in the future. We still have a lot of work to do, and there's still a lot of blood to be shed and a lot of suffering before that happens. It could have been easier if Gazans would have been let out into Egypt in the beginning of the war, if we could have choked the Hamas terrorists from food and fuel and water, then they wouldn't have been able to hold out as long as they have, and we would have been able to get more hostages home. But we were prevented from doing so. That's in the past, and I think the present and the future is different. Where I see this going, where I hope that we will go, is to continue to negotiate in order to get as many as possible of our live hostages home. And once that is exhausted, to go back to fighting and to actually finish Hamas and to create a new reality on our doorstep. We cannot allow this to continue. We cannot allow Hamas to continue to govern the Gaza Strip. We cannot allow them to stay in power, because them staying in power is us losing the October 7 war that they started with the intent of destroying the state of Israel. So to summarize, I've been saying this quite consistently over the months and the last year, I do not see a situation, and I think we have to, at some stage, recognize this, all of us. I do not see a situation where we can get those two achievements, get all of our hostages back and actually defeat Hamas and dismantle Hamas. Logically, it doesn't, in my mind, doesn't play out. And from my perspective, as much as my emotions are connected to getting all of the hostages back, and as much as I think it is our moral imperative, at the end of the day, we will have to make a tough choice. And I think the future of the state of Israel and the future of many more Israelis will force us to go back to fighting at some stage, and to do it in such a decisive way that forever, or for generations to come, rids us of the threat from Hamas. I know that will be difficult, and I know it will be very challenging and very painful for all of us this period of time, but that is what is beyond the corner, and that is where we're going.
Wow. Talk about taking the wind out of my sails, Lieutenant Colonel. Because hearing you say that really saddens me. You're saying that, of course, we all want all of the hostages out alive, but you're
We
also
do.
saying you don't see a scenario in which that comes to pass realistically, correct? If I can.
Yeah, that is correct. And I've been saying this for quite a while because
I know you have.
yeah,
I just don't want to hear it.
no, and I don't like saying it, and I would love to be totally wrong. I would love for us to magically get all of our hostages back live, and the murdered ones, bury them and get on with life, and for Hamas to evaporate, and for benign Palestinian international leadership to swoop in and fix the age-old problem called Gaza for us. But I don't think that's going to happen. We're going to have to do it ourselves, and it's going to be an imperfect situation where I don't think we're going to have all of our hostages back. And the fight is, we should fight for as many as possible. I look forward and I look at the whole issue of hostages. I'm going to write about this. I'm in the process of writing about it, but I think that if we look beyond the trenches that we're in now, and we think about, okay, how do we continue to live in this very bad neighborhood where our ancestral homeland is, without again being subject to whatever terrorist organization or nation state like Iran doing this to us in the future, hostages. And I think that there needs to be a total reset of what it means if anybody, if any entity, any enemy takes Israeli hostages in order to extort strategic or military achievements out of us. And I think that what we must recognize is that in this case, on October 7, Hamas really dealt us a strategic blow by taking 251 hostages, and it has prevented us from ensuring the security of the state of Israel. And this will continue because other terrorists will see how effective this is, and I think that other terrorists will seek to expand the amount and the variety of Israeli hostages that they will take. They will go for doing it in Europe. They will go for families on vacation in Thailand or in Bulgaria or in Romania or in other places where Hamas and Hezbollah or mostly the Iranians have infrastructure. Where will that put us then? And I think that what Israel needs to do, together with other Western countries, but first and foremost us, is to have a clear national policy of how are we going to handle future hostage situations in order to prevent them, for this not to become the beginning of, one tremendous extortion racket after the other. But in my mind, what we have to do is to signal to all of our enemies that if you dare take Israeli hostages, we will use knowingly disproportionate force that is totally disproportionate to the amount of Israeli hostages taken against whatever entity that takes our hostages, whether it's a nation state or a terrorist organization. And we will use disproportionate force because we are not going to negotiate. We are not going to be brought to our knees. We are not going to allow enemies to take hostages and dictate strategic events of national importance. And if anybody takes hostages, then the price that they will pay from the beginning will be a monstrous price in human life, including people that are not directly involved in the fighting, in national infrastructure, and in anything else that supports that entity that took it. So if this plays out in Iranian terms, if the Revolutionary Guard goes into Thailand and takes an Israeli family hostage and brings them to Iran and then tells Israel, now let's negotiate about whatever Israel is going to do, then this should mean 10 oil refineries going up in the air. It should mean assassination of Iranian leaders. It should mean infrastructure that goes up in the air, and it should be disproportionate. Otherwise, this will continue. And if there's any big takeaway from the horrible events since October the 7th, looking forward in the coming years ahead, I think that terrorists will try to amplify or emulate what Hamas did because they see the tremendous strategic benefits that they're getting from it. They know how sensitive we are to it, and we've seen Hezbollah do it in the past. Hamas has done it now. And if we don't stop it, then we will continue to suffer from this tremendously. And I think it is in our long-term strategic need to change that balance and to do it abruptly and clearly. And yes, it will be painful, but otherwise we're not going to get out of it.
I very much look forward to reading whatever it is you're writing with respect to the whole hostage issue. I expect it'll, as you suggest or hint at, deal with strategy and policy going forward. And it's interesting because what you're addressing is the taking of civilian hostages, because 99% of those who were taken alive on October 7 were civilians. You can count the number of live soldiers on one hand, and they remain in captivity. And so you're looking forward and saying, we need to get on our feet, establish policy, and move forward in a very determined way. In a nutshell, what you're saying is establish a deterrent, a strong, very clear deterrent that our enemies will be aware of. Because as I shared with you before we started, I was in Tel Aviv yesterday for a matinee performance of a play at Habima Theater called Golda. Really, really good play. And it was eerie, the absolute parallels in many ways between what went on, of course, with the outbreak of the 1973 war. Moshe Dayan seeming to have a kind of breakdown and just wanting to go fetal and walk away, and Golda saying, no, you're in this with me. And him saying, after he had taken a quick helicopter tour up into the north of Israel and seen the insane destruction that was going on and the Syrian force being brought to bear against the very, very small Israeli force. And he said, it's over. We're going to be destroyed. This is going to be the destruction of the third temple. And Golda, God bless her, said, no, it's not. Get yourself together. Go home, take a shower, wash your face, and pull yourself together. I mean, it's a very simplistic rendering of history, a very complex period that I'm giving. But Golda was very distraught as well because one of her main staffers, who was a stenographer who took down, in the old days had a stenographer machine to record minutes of meetings, what was said, what was discussed. And her son was in Sinai. And his brigade was encircled by the Egyptians. They were trapped. And one of the things the play focused on was Golda's reaction to that. These were soldiers. She's get our boys out. And they ended up staging an operation that was a failure because it was an ambush. The Egyptian army encircled these people in a fortress. They went in and tried to rescue them. And then the IDF just got hammered. Those were soldiers. These are civilians. The civilians being held in Gaza came out. And I believe this was a turning point over the last few weeks, not just for Israel, but for the world. When Yarden Bibas, whose two beautiful gingy-haired, red-headed boys, and his wife, we know, were murdered in captivity 1 month after having been taken by Hamas thugs using their bare hands to snuff out their lives. And Yarden Bibas somehow survives this. and has no idea what he's coming out to. And when told that the government and the IDF have yet to ascertain with certainty the fate of his family, he has a meltdown, quite understandably. What have you been doing for 16 months? He asks. And many hostages have come out in the last 6 weeks and expressed very similar feelings of shock and dismay, and I expect disgust. Sagi Dekochen, who was taken hostage from Nir Oz kibbutz, his wife, who was 7 months pregnant and 2 little girls, miraculously survived. And he was released also in the last 6 weeks. And he addressed Prime Minister Netanyahu very directly in a phone call. And he said, "How is it that you have not been to that kibbutz? How is it that you have not faced this incomprehensible trauma for the nation?" And I think that, whereas I don't think anyone would disagree with the way in which you set out the destruction of Hamas, ultimately and totally and forever, I do think that the taking of civilian hostages is a very exceptional and challenging experience for a country. And I think it's shaken this country, even on the right, to its core. And you know what the other thing was that they all expressed disgust with? And Sharabi said this in the interview. How is it that there's been no inquiry? How is it that the same senior army officials are still in uniform? On Thursday, the self-investigation of the IDF on the absolute disaster of October 7th. They investigated themselves, and they released the report, and they had parents come to receive the report at a special session in Glilot, which is a big army base just north of Tel Aviv. And that was on Thursday. And then on Friday, there was media coverage. And we now know it wasn't just mismanaged. It was beyond chaos. And no one was responsible. No one took responsibility. As one father of a murdered female soldier at the Nahal Oz base said, nobody cared. They were nobody's daughters. Nobody paid attention. They were unarmed. The Golani, combat troops who were there on the base and supposed to be protecting them, they didn't even have proper weapons. They had nothing. And we sit here today, 17 months later, and I ask the question, do we not have a higher duty to bring back our civilian hostages and then get to the policy changes? And do we not, of course, have the highest duty to the nation to have a full, unfettered state commission of inquiry, just as occurred following the 1973 war, and which, of course, led to Golda Meir's resignation as prime minister? I know I just threw a lot at you, but you always deliver. So,
Yeah, a lot to unpack, and most of it is it's very negative. Let's start with the after-action reviews, what you call self-investigations of the military. They are a year and a half after. They were done independently by the IDF. We have not seen the after-action reviews of the ISA, Shabak, which had a crucial role in collecting intelligence and human intelligence and assessment of Hamas before the war. We haven't seen the police, we haven't seen Mossad, and we haven't seen any investigations of many years of Israeli strategy towards the Gaza Strip and Hamas, and we have not seen any inquiry regarding government decisions, not during the 7th of October, not before. And this is one. It's not on. It's more than a drop in a bucket, but it is an incomplete picture. And even of that part, now the IDF has done some of the after-action reviews that it needs to do. Many questions remain unanswered. Many questions remain unanswered when it comes to how. How could Israel fail so badly? How could the IDF be caught with not only its pants down, but completely naked? And how could an inferior enemy inflict system failure on the IDF to actually defeat the Gaza division and to actually rout Israeli forces? How did we get there? And some of that is answered, but not sufficiently. And, it comes down to trust. The IDF is, with all its failures and shortcomings of the war, the only military we have, and still the most trusted institution that we have in Israel. Public trust in the IDF has taken a severe hit, and it will take the IDF a lot of time, its new leadership, to rebuild that trust. Public trust in the government, in the prime minister, in this government, in the political parties is extremely low because of their actions. And what I think is extremely sad is that we are preventing ourselves from defending ourselves better in the future by not actually investigating how we got to the stage that we actually got to. And until there is a National Board of Inquiry that has a real mandate to investigate the IDF, ISA, Shabak, Mossad, police, and government, Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, Minister of National Security, infrastructure, everybody, until such a thing comes in place and until that committee does its work, which will be exhausting and it will be very, it has to be very deep and detailed. Until that happens, then we won't really know why we got to where we have gotten. And most importantly, what we need to prevent from ever facing such a humiliating defeat again in the future from any other enemy. And that is what really matters. I think that the current the issue here is trust. The military doesn't trust the government doesn't trust the military. They're all playing blame games. The politicians, as they do in Israel, sadly, see themselves exempt from responsibility and personal accountability. In the military, yes, we've had various Israeli high-ranking officers say and acknowledge that they are responsible. Some of them have taken personal responsibility and left their positions. I don't think that's enough. I think that we need more severe measures to be taken against senior officers who neglected their duties. An officer like the head of Israeli military intelligence, two-star General Khaliva, in my mind, bears tremendous responsibility for the failure to foresee and to prevent this attack. The commanding officer of Southern Command, tremendous personal responsibility. The commanding officer of the Gaza division, a one-star general. All of these officers, I think it goes beyond. It's not enough to say mea culpa and to vacate the premises, but I think there should be a prosecution because the failure was so magnanimous, the recklessness and the failure, the mission failure to defend the very core, to defend Israeli civilians and to defend Israeli territory, they failed. And I think they should be held accountable, not only to say, well, yes, you're going to walk with this tremendous sign of shame for always, but that isn't enough. And I would want to see proceedings against them. And of course, with our reckless and absentee politicians, prime minister, defense minister, previous chief of staff, previous defense ministers, many who were part in designing this whole concept, the paradigm of thought that dictated how we operated, they should be held accountable. So where we are at now is, just one step. We've done one step very late, a year and a half after the event, Yes, the IDF was busy fighting a war, and we can understand that that takes a lot of the efforts and focus. But now we are one step away from the disaster, but there's still such a long way to go for us really to understand. Now, last thing I'll say is that, I've been asked hundreds, if not thousands of times over the last year, what happened and how did we get it so wrong? And I've always responded to people all over the world. There's no official inquiry yet, but here's my take based on various sources and what I've understood from the situation. Sadly, what we knew for many, many months, it hasn't changed. The findings that the IDF presented, they just they add color and detail to the general lines that we already understood in this horrible picture of failure. But none of the big lines have changed. We know that we know the paradigm of thought, we know the reliance on technology, we know about hubris, we know about not enough troops, and we knew about an enemy that deceived us very successfully, that planned well, and that was able to understand the center of gravity of the IDF, strike it, and take it out. And I've been saying this for many months. And what we learn now from the investigations is just how bad the failure was, but it doesn't really change what we've known for many, many months. And what I have been saying, I don't think I'm on the side of trusting the IDF. I believe that the IDF is the institution that must be rebuilt, and it must regain the trust of the people, because the state of Israel has no ability to continue to exist in this extremely hostile neighborhood without a strong, healthy, victory-oriented IDF that seeks decisive battle against its enemies. We can do with the horrible politicians we have that won't be a fatal threat, but without a strong IDF, we won't. So the IDF is the most important organization that needs to be rebuilt and revamped. And then we also need to deal with our horribly inept and failing leadership, prime minister, minister of defense, and all of the others that were part of the national security organizations, the National Security Council, Tzachi Hanegbi, also very much absent during the war and since the war and after it. Prime Minister first and foremost. All of that needs to change for us to be better. But in the balance, in the blame game, and the media spins between the government and the military, where the government continues to try to divert everything to the military and the Shabak and to exempt themselves from responsibility. Yes, there is tremendous and unimaginable blame and responsibility with the military. And in this battle between politicians and military, just because we think that the politicians are worse and extremely bad, dishonest, and failing, doesn't mean that there isn't tremendous, deep, widespread rot in the IDF that needs to be dealt with. They are not mutually exclusive, and we need to deal with that and with that. What worries me is that at the end of the day, and with this I'll finish, at the end of the day, if the politicians get to blame the fighting organizations, IDF, Shabak, and police for everything, they get to walk away without a national board of inquiry and without taking personal accountability for their failed strategies and actions, which they should, and without Israel at the national level being better off.
So, well done. And that was a great wrap up. And now I'm going to wrap up your wrap up. And, hostess last word. I think that the problem, yes, we need a strong IDF, and everyone understands that. The problem is what many are calling the class of October 6th officers, who are so invested in their very poor management and interpretation for a long period of time. And that fundamentally is the containment strategy, the approach to Gaza that said, keep them happy, throw them, a few shekels now and then, and they're just as interested in the well-being of their people as we are in ours. That was such a disastrous assumption that is embedded in everything this country did, politically, militarily, in terms of intelligence. So I think that the idea of all of these same people who had a lot vested in this very flawed paradigm and decision-making, to leave them in place for so long after October 7th, in my view, has been very wrong-headed. But that's the way it is. And now they're starting to go, and I'm going to close with some reflections with respect to Sharabi and others, because I think that when these people walk out of that hell and tell us we should listen, and Eli Sharabi was disbelieving, shocked. You could just see it. He didn't know how to react when Ilana Dayan, the interviewer, said, well, there hasn't been an inquiry, and many say that'll just be a political witch hunt. And Eli Sharabi looks back at her so powerfully and said, no one asked me what my political views were when I was taken hostage. No one asked my wife and children what their political views were before they were murdered. It's an absurdity, and it's so disrespectful at all levels of leadership to say that to us. We need to know. I do look at the Nahal Oz story as being a real distillation of so much that went on. And sometimes it's overwhelming to look at everything, right? But the report that we got on IDF, Nahal Oz, the self-report investigation, whatever you want to call it, it's more than telling us what we already knew. It also puts the imprimatur of the IDF on it. It makes it official.
Yep.
And there was additional detail, and that counts for something. I just want to also mention what I thought was a very powerful interview last night on Channel 11 by Moav Vardi, an Israeli journalist, with the parents of two young soldiers, one female, one male, who fell in trying to defend Nahal Oz base on October 7th. And they too were demanding an inquiry. They too want answers. And the mother of the male soldier who fell as a hero, she said, I'm just not impressed by people taking responsibility anymore because I look at the consequences. I don't even know what that means. They're still in office. They're still in uniform. And what I took from that was it's an affront. It's an affront to every single person living in this country. It's an affront to every good soldier, to every family that's made so much sacrifice, that this is not addressed. I personally, you have your mission, I have mine, and I will do everything I can to work with those who are trying to bring about a state commission, a full state commission of inquiry, because I don't see a way forward without that reckoning and accounting. And on one final note as well, I agree with you that we should be focused on establishing deterrence, of course, with respect to attacks on Israeli civilians and soldiers. But the level of responsibility and the dereliction of duty that went on for so long at such high levels demands more accountability than I take responsibility. See you later. I'm going home. This is next level. And I see you nodding vigorously, so that means we agree. And it's probably a great time to wrap up.
Yep.
Thank you so much for your time, as always, and insights. And I always say the same thing. I could do this all day, but got to go eat lunch.
Yeah. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you, and safe travels.
Thank you.
We leave you with the full 5-minute plus clip of Eli Sharabi speaking with Ilana Dayan, the clip that has gone viral. Thanks for being here. Please support our work. Subscribe, ring the bell, comment, engage. I hope you are enjoying our fabulous new surroundings. This is the beginning of the new studio, and it's my first day, and yeah, it's a little overwhelming. Lots of machines and gadgets and things to do, but I'm getting the hang of it. So again, thanks for being here. See you soon. I'm dropping some great material from my recent trip to Germany and the surging anti-Semitism there. So enjoy your Sunday, and until next time, signing off from my home on a kibbutz in the beautiful Western Negev in southern Israel. If you haven't been here, you should go. More than a few of our subscribers, just before I sign off, have written to me asking for more content. All of it. The written, the podcast, this visual podcast, and I'd love to oblige. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to ask our loyal readers and viewers to please consider supporting our work with a paid subscription. I know, but every person makes a huge difference. stateoftelaviv.com, all one word, takes you to the website. You can subscribe. It'll take you 2 minutes, and it will help us to bring you more of the content that you so value. Thanks again. Have a good one.
בשלושה הימים הראשונים אני כפות בידיים מאחורה, כפות ברגליים עם חבלים שקוראים לי את הבשר, וקצת אוכל, קצת מים ביום. אני זוכר שאני לא מצליח להירדם מהכאבים, כי גם החבלים כבר בתוך הבשר, וכל תנועה אתה רוצה לצרוח, וגם אתה כפות עם ידיים מאחורה, אז הכתפיים נורא נורא כואבות, ושום תנוחה לא מספיק טובה. ואז יש רגעים שאתה פשוט מתעלף. אתה מתעלף, אתה מאבד את ההכרה, מתעורר אחרי 2-3, והכאבים ממשיכים. ואני מתחנן בפניהם שיורידו שיעבירו לפחות את הקשירה של הידיים קדימה. ואז אני אהיה רגוע, הכל יהיה בסדר. והם לא מסכימים, אבל אחרי 3 ימים מורידים לנו את החבלים.
רק לפני רגע היית חבר קיבוץ, עם אישה ו2 בנות, עם עבודה נהדרת, עם חיים נפלאים, ופתאום אתה זרוק בעזה, כפות ידיים ורגליים.
כן.
אתה שואל את עצמך, רגע, מה נהיה?
אני לא עסוק בזה, כי אני מבין כבר את הסיטואציה, ואני יודע שלהתבוסס בתוך סיטואציה לא מקדמת אותי לשום מקום. אתה מנהל את ההישרדות שלך כל הזמן ומחפש פתרונות כל הזמן. כואב לך, אתה מחפש שלא יכאב לך. אתה רעב, אתה מחפש לא להיות רעב. אתה מבין שאין שליטה, שאתה נתון בידי אחרים, עדיין בתוך הכאוס הזה, אתה מנסה קצת לקחת את השליטה.
וזה יוצר שליטה בתוך האין שליטה.
בדיוק, כל הזמן. אילנה, את יודעת מה זה לפתוח מקרר? שאנשים יחשבו טוב טוב בבית כשהם פותחים מקרר, זה עולם ומלואו. זה עולם ומלואו לפתוח מקרר. המושג הזה בכלל, של אדם חופשי שיכול לקחת משם פרי, או ירק, או ביצה, או מים, פרוסת לחם. על זה אתה חולם כל יום. לא אכפת לך מהמכות שאתה חוטף, ואתה חוטף מכות, ושוברים לי צלעות. לא אכפת לי.
הרעב.
תן לי עוד חצי פיתה.
אפשר להסביר את התחושה של הרעב?
אי אפשר.
זה הבטן שנדבקת לגב?
בטן שנדבקת לגב, אבל אתה כבר רואה את הבטן שלך ממש נכנסת פנימה באיזשהו שלב, ואתה לא מאמין שזה קורה לגוף שלך.
בתקופות הגרועות זה אומר שמה אוכלים?
בתקופות הגרועות אוכלים פעם ביום קערת פסטה.
וזה האוכל לכל היום?
שזה 250-300 קלוריות.
ליום?
ליום, שזה 10 ממה שאני צריך. ואם זה קורה יום, יומיים, זה לא נורא. במשך 0.5 שנה אנחנו אוכלים את הכמויות האלה. 0.5 שנה, יום-יום. כשאתה מבקש עוד משהו ופתאום זורקים עליך איזה תמר יבש, זה נראה לך כמו הארוחה הכי טובה בעולם. כל דבר כזה זה הצלה.
ולמה החלטת להתראיין, אלי?
פשוט באמת, באמת, באמת אסור להשאיר אף אחד שם מאחור. כל דקה, אני זוכר כל דקה במנהרה, שאנחנו אומרים אולי היום, אולי היום. נשאר שם ילד שפגשתי לפני 1 וחודשיים, אחרי 50 יום בעזה.
אלון אוהל.
אלון אוהל. והוא נכנס לי ללב, מבחינתי אימצתי אותו מהרגע הראשון, תמכנו אחד בשני. 24/7 ביחד. כל דבר אני יודע עליו, על המשפחה שלו, כל תאריך, כל תחביב של אחותו, של אחיו, של ההורים שלו, הכל אני יודע. איך אפשר להשאיר אותו מאחור?
ואתה יודע שהוא בעצם עכשיו אחרון במנהרה הזו. אחרון. זה נורא קשה להישאר לבד. כשהיינו עוד 4, עוד זה נותן לך כוח. יש לך עם מי לדבר, יש לך עם מי לקום בבוקר ועם מי לישון בלילה. אז מנקודת מבטו של אלון, הייתם 4, 2 שוחררו, אתה ואור, ואז שוחרר אליה בשבת שעברה.
אני לא יכול לדמיין את הרגע הזה. לא יכול לדמיין. ביום שאני עוזב, המחבלים קוראים אותי ממנו, הוא פשוט מסרב לעזוב, תפס אותי. רגע מאוד קשה.
הוא אמר משהו?
הוא אמר שהוא שמח בשבילי. הבטחתי לו שאני לא אעזוב אותו שם, שאני אלחם עליו. הבטחתי לו את זה. אמרתי לו שזה עניין של ימים, ממש.
אז בעצם בשבילו אתה פה.
לגמרי. בשבילו עוד חטופים אחרים.
We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.